In the last video, I promised we'd look at two textual variants together in more detail. So that's what we'll do in this video and the next, Isaiah 53 and Psalm 145. Now this will serve as an example of what it's like to use a critical apparatus in a diplomatic edition like the BHS, and reference some other key sources. The goal is to give you a more concrete idea of what we've been talking about so far. And by the way, I realize that some of the things in the previous videos may have been overwhelming or confusing or just difficult to understand. And that's normal at the beginning of a course on textual criticism. When I started studying these things in seminary, I was really lost for a while. So don't worry, you'll eventually catch on. Just be patient and enjoy the ride, and you'll soon see how all the pieces fit together. It'll probably be a good idea to watch the videos in this series several times so you can master the content. Just watching them once won't be enough for most people, and that's okay. At this point, I also want to mention one of the important core presuppositions that we hold as we approach this area of study. We believe that God is sovereign over every molecule in the universe. We call this meticulous sovereignty. As Charles Spurgeon famously put it, I believe that every particle of dust that dances in the sunbeam does not move an atom more or less than God wishes. That every particle of spray that dashes against the steamboat has its orbit as well as the sun in the heavens. That the chaff from the hand of the winnower is steered as the stars in their courses. The creeping of an aphid over the rosebud is as much fixed as the march of the devastating pestilence. The fall of leaves from a poplar is as fully ordained as the tumbling of an avalanche. This truth must inform our study of the manuscripts, giving us confidence that God is not in the least surprised by the way His word has been copied and handed down to us, nor is He frustrated or thwarted in His desire to preserve what He has spoken and revealed. Jesus said that not one sparrow falls to the ground outside of His Father's will. So if God is sovereign over even tiny birds, He's able to care for the transmission and conservation of His word. This does not mean that God has prevented all human error or the ravages of time from affecting the preservation of what He revealed. The providence of God is somewhat mysterious to us as limited creatures. And if you're interested in exploring this doctrine further, I'll link some excellent books in the description. So now it's time to check out an example of how to use the critical apparatus in the BHS. Remember that a critical apparatus is basically a bunch of footnotes that tell you about variant readings. Variant readings are different ways a text has been written in other manuscripts and ancient versions. And also, I should remind you that when we use the term critical, we don't mean it in a negative sense, but rather in the sense of a scientific presentation of the evidence, which allows you to study the text and reach your own conclusions based on what you find in the apparatus. The apparatus won't include all the variants in existence because that would take up too much space. And many variants, such as minor spelling differences, are not significant enough to mention. So the editors of the critical apparatus have selected the variants they think are the most important for the reader to be aware of. So let's begin by reading Isaiah 53, 7-8 in the BSB. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet He did not open His mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so He did not open His mouth. By oppression and judgment He was taken away, and who can recount His descendants? For He was cut off from the land of the living. He was stricken for the transgression of my people. The last part of the verse says the following in Hebrew from the Masoretic text. Mi pesha ami nega lamu. Literally it says, from or because of the transgression of my people, a blow or strike to them. In the BHS text, we can see the superscript D at the end of the last word of the verse. This tells us that there's a footnote in the apparatus about that word. When we go down to find what corresponds to verse 8 and the letter D, we see this note. Gothic G, eis thanaton, el lamavit. Now you might be a bit confused at first by the form lamo. Why is the mem there? If we look at the entry for the lamed preposition in the BDB lexicon, we'll find that this is either a poetic form for lahem, to them, theirs, or lo, to him or his. BDB then cites Isaiah 53:8 as an example of where it may be a poetic form of lo, to him. But most ancient translations of this verse, like the Syriac Peshitta and Vulgate, interpret it as plural, them. Some scholars like Peter Gentry argue that interpreting this as a third masculine singular to him is impossible. But for the sake of time, we won't get into all the arguments for that. So let's unpack all of this. First, BHS has the symbol of the Septuagint, which is a Gothic G for Greek, followed by two Greek words, eis thanaton, which means to death. This is telling us that the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation, rendered this word as to death, even though the Hebrew in the Masoretic text does not speak of death, but simply says lamo, to them. Then we see the letter L in lowercase, which is an abbreviation of the Latin word meaning reed. This tells us what the Hebrew would say if we took the testimony of the Septuagint as authoritative in this case. The Hebrew in the note says lamavit, which means to death. So all of this shows us that the Septuagint has something meaningfully different from the Masoretic text in this last part of the verse, and it may be because the ancient translator had a Hebrew manuscript that said lamavit. So a translation of the Septuagint in this verse would be, because of the iniquities of my people, he was led to death. Compare that with what the King James Version has, which followed the Masoretic text. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. Now, the BHS only takes us so far in this case. There is other evidence that we could compile for our analysis, such as the text of the Dead Sea Scrolls. One resource that can help us get even more detail about some of the most important textual variants in the Hebrew Bible is the Critique textuelle de l'Ancien Testament, otherwise known as CTAT, or the Hebrew Old Testament Text Project, led by Dominique Barthélemy and Eugene Nida. The PDFs are free, but only in French at the moment. But if you don't know French, you can use AI or Google to translate the portions you need. Now, if we look at Volume 2, we find that the committee concluded that there was good reason to believe that the LXX reflects the correct reading of lamavit, in spite of the fact that it represents a minority among the ancient witnesses. My friend Dr. John Mead has laid out the complete list of witnesses in his excellent article on this textual problem. Here's what it looks like. Go ahead and pause the video to read through each one carefully. Now, the passive verbal form, nuga, he was stricken, represented by the Dead Sea Scroll 1Q Isaiah A, provides a key piece of evidence as we evaluate the witnesses. Here's what I mean. If the verse originally ended with the word lamavit, to death, then it would make more sense to have a passive form of the verb, naga, which would be nuga. He was stricken, rather than a nominal form of that root, which now appears in the Masoretic text, nega, a strike or a blow. So the sentence would read, he was stricken to death. Now, if the tav in lamavit was accidentally omitted at some point before 1Q Isaiah was copied, then it makes sense that the scribe kept the passive verb, nuga, which he spelled like this with a vav to represent the U vowel. So it appears that 1Q Isaiah A represents a transitional form of the text, which reads, "Because of the transgression of his people, he was stricken for them." It's plausible that future scribes would have adjusted the verbal form nuga to the nominal form a strike or a blow in order to harmonize it better to the corrupted reading lamo at the end of the verse. In the end, the Septuagint bears witness to both the verb he was stricken and the oldest form of the final word, to death. Since the Septuagint's text also preserves the continuity of the masculine singular subject found in the rest of the song, the following reading commends itself as what probably was written by Isaiah. "For he was cut off from the land of the living. Because of the transgression of my people, he was stricken to death." Most mainstream English versions don't reflect this conclusion, and many don't even include the issue in a footnote. Interestingly, although most of them reject the to death reading of the LXX, they accept or reflect the reading of 1Q Isaiah A and render a passive verb, was punished or stricken. One example is the NIV, which reads, "For the transgression of my people, he was punished." John Mead writes, "The textual decision here significantly changes the meaning of this song with respect to whether the servant dies and, in turn, who the servant is. Only the Hebrew parent text of the LXX preserves the servant's death on account of the people's transgression. Later scribal mistakes obscure the servant's death and its purpose found in the original text." What's at issue, then, is ultimately something central to the New Testament's witness about Jesus. One of the matters of chief importance that Paul received is that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, 1 Corinthians 15:3. Paul and those who transmitted early tradition about the Messiah's death seems to have been reading the version of Isaiah 53:8 argued for here, which explains how he arrived at this conclusion. Now again, this is just an example to help you see where we're going. I don't expect everyone to fully understand it, but it should help you get a better idea of what we're talking about when we refer to textual criticism. Later in this course, we'll see more examples, get to know more resources, and go into even greater detail. In the next video, we'll take a look at a fascinating variant in Psalm 145, which involves a missing verse. Until then, take care and shalom.